Hey guys, hoping all is well. So in this video we're going to be continuing our read along of the Secret Zoo Riddles and Danger, and we're going to be starting today with chapter 36. So as always, please feel free to follow along and we'll jump into it right away. So chapter 36, New Light. Megan, having running down a different hallway, slowed when she sensed she was at its end. She threw her arms forward and touched the space around her. Her fingertips soon found something soft and velvety, the curtain hanging above the entrance to the Chamber of Lights. Big gold rings clattered along an overhead rod as she threw open the curtain. When she stepped into the room, which was no bigger than a walk-in closet, her memories of the day she'd vanished into the Darklands from this place sent a chill through her. In the exhibit's single wall-mounted aquarium, dozens of flashlight fish blinked on and off like underwater fireflies. She stepped up and placed her palms against the glowing glass. I don't know if you can understand me," she said softly. "Maybe you can, the way Blizzard and Podgy and Marlowe seem to." The fish continued to swim back and forth, winking on and off at random intervals. A few gathered near the front of the tank. "We're in trouble. The Sasquatches. They're escaping. This whole zoo is dark. I've seen what you can do. The way you can light up." In her mind, Megan returned to the day she had disappeared from this very room, the start of her terrifying ordeal as a prisoner of the Sasquatches. She remembered how the peculiar fish had begun to brightly glow until they pushed forward a blinding light, sending her to the Darklands. She paused to collect her thoughts. "We need you to help us. We need your light across creepy critters. All the aquariums. They connect. We've learned that." Her efforts suddenly seemed pointless. Surely these fish couldn't understand her. Could they even hear her? Did her voice penetrate the glass? One of the fish stopped blinking and began instead to steadily glow. The darkness lifted from Megan's hands, which were still pressed against the glass. Then it lifted from her arms, her chest. The walls of the Chamber of Lights slowly came into view. A second fish began to shine, then a third, a fourth. As the darkness continued to melt away, Megan realized something was standing beside her. With a yelp, she turned and discovered Podgy. He apparently followed her down the hall. "What are you?" Podgy poked his head toward her and fluttered his eyelids. He then stepped forward and pinged his bill against the glass. Hearing the sound, the flashlight fish swarmed to the front of the tank, mere inches from the point of the penguin's bill. Podgy taped the glass a few more times, then he turned and waddled out of the room, the dim light of the fish following him. Just outside the Chamber of Lights, Podgy faced the aquarium through the open door. Then he raised his flippers to the darkness around him. Seeing this, the fish swam back to the back of the aquarium, where, one by one, they disappeared into a hollow branch. Within seconds, all of them had vanished toward the secret zoo, taking the light with them. "No way," Megan breathed. She wondered if this could possibly work. She felt her way back out the door, where she bumped into Podgy. She stared down the hall that she had just crossed, seeing nothing. Soon, however, points of light began to dot the darkness along the walls. Megan counted 10, 15, 30. They illuminated the aquariums like tiny bulbs. The fish were portaling into different aquariums, just as Megan had hoped they would. She knew that by their number they were coming from the secret zoo. The shape of the hallway began to appear, its height, its width, its jags and turns. Then all at once, the spots began to shine more brightly as the fish spilled forth their magic light. It took only seconds for the tanks, the tiles, the fake goop and vines to become clear. The normal habitants of the tanks that the flashlight fish had invaded were swimming circles in corners. In dry aquariums, snakes coiled along branches, spiders struck to the back glass, and crabs pinched one another's claws. As the flashlight fish continued to glow, Podgy waddled in front of Megan and turned his back to her. What he wanted was obvious, and Megan wrapped her arms around him just below his neck. "Let's go," she said. Podgy raised his flippers, took a few strides, and lunged into flight. Megan nestled into position across his back, letting her legs dangle behind her the way that she'd seen Noah do. Podgy soared down the hall, veering from side to side. As the corridor zigzagged, so did Podgy. He nearly bounced off the aquariums, startling fish behind strands of seaweed. At the end of the hallway, Podgy swept into the creepy core and hung a right turn. Without hesitation, he flew toward Gator Falls, where the others were trapped. Chapter 37. The Advance. Noah stood on his left leg while one alligator crept beneath his right foot and a second alligator waited in front of him. Its mouth hinged open. He teetered, almost completely lost his balance, then righted himself again. To his side rose a single point of light. It seemed to float in space, a pinch of brightness that reminded him of a glow-in-the-dark button. He strained to see where it was coming from and guessed a tank on the other side of the hall. Seconds after it appeared, so did another, this one roughly 10 feet down from it. Then a third dot arose, and then a fourth. All down the hall, glowing spots pierced the darkness. He turned back to his predicament with the alligators. Knowing he had to do something, he lowered his right leg, feeling the space with its toes to see if the alligator had passed. Finally, it had. He immediately dropped his foot to the newly vacant spot and swiveled away from the open mouth of the alligator, which snapped shut at the very moment. As the bright spots continued to appear along the walls, Noah realized what they were. Flashlight fish. The fish the scouts had encountered in the Chamber of Lights. They were using the secret zoo to swim into new aquariums. Noah had no doubt that his sister was responsible for this. Surely she wanted their magical light to illuminate their entire exhibit. From somewhere beside Noah rose Ella's whimpering voice. "Guys! I'm in trouble!" Her words were followed by a Sasquatch's grunt and an alligator's growl. There was a big thud against the floor, the footfall of a Sasquatch. "Big trouble!" The flashlight fish began to shine brighter, illuminating the tanks and the edges of the hallway. Noah swept his stare across the aquariums. Those that were filled with water had been invaded by flashlight fish. In the other tanks, the dry ones, snakes and lizards and giant millipedes raced along the glass, spooked by everything unfolding. As more and more light poured forth, the entire hallway took shape. For the first time, Noah saw the floor, and it terrified him. In both directions, it was packed with alligators. They were crawling toward the creepy core, their bodies squirming above the thrusts of their stubby legs, their staggered fangs protruding from closed jaws. Ella was standing beside one wall and Richie the other. Surrounded by alligators, the two looked as though they were wading through a horrific river with reptilian spikes in the places of waves and whitecaps. To Noah, it looked like something from a nightmare. Around the descenders, the alligators bumped and jostled one another. Tameron's tail was buried among their bodies, and Sam's wings were raised high. Sasquatches were scattered about. Standing with their knees bent and their arms raised, they looked ready to pounce. They inched through the crowd, their enormous feet rubbing against the alligators' bodies. Sam's voice rang out. "Descenders, I'm counting 12 Sasquatches. You seeing the same?" In unison, his friends answered yes. Noah stared past the descenders and saw Gator Falls near the end of the hall, about 40 yards away. Reaching from the floor to the ceiling, it looked like a swampy wetland covered in tall grass, moss, lily pads. In it, 2 levels were joined by muddy inclines, and 3 waterfalls spilled from the higher level into a shallow pool. Alligators were crawling out of the broken glass wall. Because they were headed toward the creepy core, the short hallway section beyond the exhibit was empty. Noah pointed down the hall. "See that clearing? We gotta get over there." An alligator snapped at Ella, just missing her as she jumped to an open tile on the floor. Richie said, "Whatever we do, we better do it soon." "Guys," Hannah called, "look!" From out of the creepy core and into the hallway flew Podgy and Megan. As Podgy soared over the alligators, he dipped and rose and swerved, deliberately brushing the bulge of his stomach along their backs. The agitated reptile snapped at him, missing by inches as he veered all around. Sam said, "Tameron, give me a path behind Podgy." "You got it." Richie said, "What are—" Sam cut him off. "Everyone, when Podgy flies by, fall in line behind me." "But you're surrounded by alligators," Richie pointed out. Sam cast a hard stare at Richie. "Not for long." He then turned to Tameron, whose tail swept high into the air. Richie's jaw dropped. "Solana and Hannah, if the Sasquatches come at us, stop them," Sam instructed. Solana nodded. Hannah popped her gum. As Podgy reached the Sasquatches, he steered through them, keeping just beyond the swing of their arms. Alligators continued to snap at him, their front legs springing from the floor. Podgy's flippers smacked their broad snouts, almost insultingly. As soon as Podgy soared past, Tameron jumped in front of Sam and spun his tail around, sweeping the alligators aside. Like snow behind the push of a plow, the alligators flew through the air. When the tail reached Sam, he jumped it like the rope, allowing the floor around him to be cleared. Noah looked on in disbelief. Tameron had opened a circle on the floor that spanned the width of the hallway. Alligators lay against the walls, heaped atop one another, writhing and kicking and biting. Their tails snapped and thrashed, smashing out the fronts of aquariums and filling the hallway with sharp reports of shattering glass. "Move!" Sam ordered. Hannah pushed off on the soles of her boots and sprang into the air toward the open circle. She grabbed the wrists of Solana's raised arms and pulled her along. The girls dropped into the clearing and rolled gracefully to their feet. 5 or 6 alligators separated Noah from the clearing, where the descenders now stood. Ella and Richie were in the same predicament, and both were looking at Noah for direction. Knowing they didn't have time to waste, Noah began jumping across the alligators' backs, his ankles rolling on their knobby spikes. Each time he pushed off one, it whipped around, snapping at the space he just emptied. Ella and Richie followed his lead, and it took only seconds for the three of them to reach the open circle. With everyone in position, Sam called out, "Tameron, go!" Tameron ran to the edge of the clearing, where he crouched and again swung his tail around, beginning a fresh sweep on the crowded floor. Once more, the alligators went airborne and crashed into the walls, shattering glass and spilling the contents of the aquariums, black beetles and spiny-legged spiders. As Tameron worked, so did Sam. He reached his wings out to the sides so that a wall of feathers rose from the center of the circle to stretch the width of the hall. Startled at the sight, many alligators retreated, crawling over one another, hissing and growling and biting. As Sam advanced towards Gator Falls, the scouts, Hannah and Solana, stayed huddled behind him. The Sasquatches stood by and watched. One beat its knuckles against its chest. Another punched its fist into a fish tank, which spilled like a waterfall onto the alligators beneath it. "Okay," Ella said. "Those guys look really, really mad." A Sasquatch charged across the alligators and leaped into the clearing. Hannah sprang forward and flipped over, landing briefly on a handstand before thrusting the soles of her boots squarely against the Sasquatch's gut. The monster buckled over and flew through the air. Far down the hall, it crashed to the ground and slid on the tiles, bumping alligators out of its path before finally coming to a stop near the creepy core in a heap of muscle and mangy hair. Ella turned to Richie. "And you always thought your shoes were pretty cool." When a second Sasquatch lunged into the open space, Solana threw her shoulder forward and sank dozens of quills into its body. Rubbing its chest, the beast staggered back to the edge of the clearing and stumbled over the alligators. As it hit the tiles, the confused reptiles attacked it, their powerful jaws clamping onto its body. Tameron continued to swing his tail around, opening a path for the other crossers. Sam stroked his arms up and down, sending waves through his wings and frightening the alligators back. "Guys," Sam momentarily dropped his wings. "Look." The Sasquatches ahead of them were retreating into Gator Falls, fleeing back into the secret zoo. A minute later, Tameron pushed the last of the alligators aside, and the group moved into the open area at the end of the hall, where Megan and Podgy were waiting. In front of Gator Falls, glass lay everywhere, glinting in the shine of the flashlight fish. Looking into the exhibit was like peering into a swamp full of rich, deep greens. From the middle waterfall, a trail of alligators was still emerging. "That middle waterfall," said Sam. "Beyond it is a straight drop to the secret creepy critters. We gotta get in there and close the portal. The curtain, it has to come down. It's seal off the sector immediately." "How do we get past the alligators?" Richie asked. "The tunnel behind the waterfall is at least 10 feet high. We have to go in through the top." Understanding what Sam was getting at, they all turned to Podgy, who merely returned their gazes in an unusual ho-hum manner. Noah stepped in beside the Emperor Penguin, saying, "I'll go with him. Someone has to pull off the curtain." When the other scouts protested, Noah immediately raised his hand, saying, "There's no time to talk about this." "The two of them fly best together," Sam pointed out. Noah had moved in behind Podgy and draped his arms over his body, just above his flippers. "This is the only way," Sam told him. "The curtain, it's not going to come down easy, but pull hard enough and it will." Noah nodded. "The secret creepy critters looks a lot like this place." Sam gestured to the fake gunk dripping from ceiling and the walls of the aquariums around him. "Only bigger. Much bigger. You'll portal into the secret Gator Falls. Find an open spot to swing around in. As soon as you pass through the portal, grab the curtain and don't let go." "You got that, Podge?" Noah asked. Podgy cocked his head to one side in what seemed like a yes. "Noah, get in and out of the secret creepy critters as fast as you can. It's not..." Sam's voice trailed off. He chose his next words carefully. "It's not a place you want to be." Chapter 38. The Secret Creepy Critters. To build up speed, Podgy and Noah flew down the hallway into the creepy core and circled back. On their return, they veered into Gator Falls through the broken wall of glass and steered toward the middle waterfall. They struck the falls and passed into the tunnel, Noah's head missing the ceiling by at least a foot. Sloping down into the ground, the tunnel was at least 50 yards long. Its brick walls glistened with moisture from the falls, and water streamed down the tiny mortar trenches onto the dirt floor, muddying it. The wet tunnel ended at a single velvet curtain. Alligators were steadily crawling out from under it, juggling the muddy tassels along their backs. As Podgy flew along the top of the cave, his flippers reached above Noah and clapped against the ceiling. He sped along, leaving little time for the alligators to do more than lift their snouts and hiss. A few snapped at the space beneath him. When Podgy came to the portal, he flattened his flippers against his sides and pushed his bill forward, streamlining his body. Noah turned his head and squeezed his eyes shut. They hit the curtain that they were filled with Banu's magic. As they portaled into the secret Gator Falls, Noah opened his eyes and felt his heart jump. The secret Gator Falls looks like a zoo exhibit it was attached to. Steep, grassy inclines rose all around, and countless waterfalls fell from the heights. Alligators crowded the ground, their feet splashing through mud, their bodies streaming along the surface of shallow streams. Noah sensed something behind him and peered over his shoulder. 5 Sasquatches were chasing after them, even heaving its weight across all 4 of its limbs, like an ape. "Podgy," Noah called out. "Behind us!" Just as Noah looked forward again, Podgy swerved to miss a waterfall and flew in behind it. They moved beside the wall of water like a surfboarder beside the falling crest of a wave. Noah squinted against a cloud of mist, and a second later, the duo emerged in the open air again, Noah blinking the water out of his eyes. An alligator sprang forward into the air and snapped its jaws at Noah's feet, just missing. A second alligator attacked, and then a third. Noah swung his dangling legs left and right to avoid their bites. Podgy flew beneath another waterfall, this time soaking Noah, whose wet ear flaps clung to the sides of his head. Seconds later, they came upon the long stretch of wall of water. Unable to go around it, Podgy went through it, and he and Noah appeared in a new space. Here there were no alligators. Thick fog hung all around, and moss-covered branches reached out at them like grabbing arms of monsters. The ground was muddied, pitted with holes, and marked with patches of thin grass, their long blades drooping under the weight of the air. Bugs were everywhere, running across everything. There was still no big place big enough to turn around. Podgy twisted his head back for a brief look and continued forward. As they flew between the two tall bushes, something that felt like a thread struck Noah's face. It clung to his cheeks and invaded his mouth. He swiped one hand over his lips, and then a thin material struck to his fingers. Podgy, he realized, had just flown through a massive cobweb. Spiders were crawling all over them. There were hundreds, their bodies round as marbles, their legs thick as toothpicks. Noah swiped at his arm again and again. Spiders flew into the air and burst beneath his palms, their gooey guts smearing his jacket. Noah lost his hold and slid down the penguin's side, flattening his flipper. With only one working wing, Podgy veered into the ground, spraying mud everywhere. When Noah fell off his back and rolled, something spilled over him. He lay in darkness, covered in something that was moving. He felt thousands of tiny legs pattering along his body, pricking his clothes and skin. Noah pushed himself to his hands and knees, slinging the unknown things everywhere. He stared out. All around him, the ground was writhing. What looked like snakes, Noah realized, were centipedes. Giant centipedes, each nearly a foot long. They crawled over his body, their segmented bodies squirming. When Noah felt one of his bare neck, he pinched it in his fingertips and flung it into the air, where it twirled away end over end. Overcome with revulsion, he jumped to his feet, centipedes tumbling off his body. He felt them moving inside his jacket and frantically unzipped it and flung it to the ground, where the swell of centipedes absorbed it. Behind him came a low, angry growl. Noah swung around and saw nothing but fog. In front of him, a new growl echoed the first. He spun back, centipedes popping beneath his feet. Again, nothing, only fog. Then growls came from new places. He turned and turned. Nothing. He waited. The only sound was the dull clinking of the centipedes' hard bodies, the soft patter of their steps. On all sides of Noah, the fog began to churn and break apart. One after another, Sasquatches began to appear. They prowled toward Noah, crunching centipedes. Noah searched for his penguin friend. "Podgy! Over here!" The Sasquatches crept forward, their beastly forms rising out of the fog. Centipedes continued to squirm up Noah's legs. Heaps crawled behind his waist, blanketing his body with theirs. Several slipped beneath his shirt and writhed along his skin. One wormed up to his shoulder, and Noah felt a pinpoint of pain as he was bitten. He reached under his collar, grabbed the centipede, and chucked it away. "Podgy!" The Sasquatches closed in. Centipedes were crawling all over them, burrowing through from their long hair. A Sasquatch howled and batted one off its arm. Another reached over its shoulder, pulled away a centipede, then chomped off its head and tossed its gooey remains aside. Noah's insides churned. He cupped his hands around his mouth. "Podgy!" The emperor penguin burst forward, his flippers stirring the fog. He swerved around a Sasquatch, narrowly eluding the swipe of its claws, and headed for Noah, flying low. Noah grabbed hold of the penguin and slung himself onto his back. His sudden weight plunged Podgy into the centipedes, but the penguin veered back into the air, his flippers flipping the arthropods all around. He steered through toward two other Sasquatches and headed back to the portal towards the Clarksville Zoo. Noah said, I can't believe that worked. As they flew back through the wide waterfall, Podgy gained more and more speed. The curtain appeared. Dangling from a rod, it covered an opening along a steep, muddy slope. Beneath it, alligators crawled. Around it, 4 Sasquatches stood guard. As Podgy approached, the Sasquatches fixed their eyes on him. "They see us!" Less than 100 feet from the curtain now, Podgy flew at a breathtaking pace, veering from side to side as he negotiated the best angle of approach. Noah hung on, his legs fishtailing in the air behind him. They reached the Sasquatches, and the first one swung at Podgy, who dodged the blow. The big penguin dipped and swerved through the attacks of the others, then pushed through the portal. As the curtain brushed against Noah, he pinched it in the crook of his arm and pulled it with all his might. One after another, the gold rings snapped free from the overhead rod. Clink, 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 sounding like machine gun fire in an old video game. As Noah listened for the last ring to break apart, it didn't, and he was yanked into the air. He swung backward on the curtain, watching in horror as Podgy flew deeper into the Clarksville Zoo without him. In front of Noah, an alligator turned back its snout and spotted him. Then it whipped its body around and pried open its jaw, ready to strike. And I'll stop the video there, ending chapter 38. But I hope you guys enjoyed this video, and when we continue our read-along of The Secret Zoo, Riddles in Danger, we're going to be continuing with chapter 39. As always, guys, thank you so much for watching this video, and please take good care of yourselves and be safe. Bye.